Have you ever noticed that whenever people compare Daemon Targaryen and Aemond Targaryen, the conversation almost always comes down to one thing: who had the bigger dragon? You'll hear people say, well, Aemond rode Vhagar, the largest dragon alive. Of course he was the better dragon rider. Or you'll hear the opposite: Daemon defeated Aemond at the God's Eye, so he was obviously better. But here's the thing: those two arguments completely miss the point. Because having the biggest dragon doesn't automatically make you the greatest dragon rider. If it did, every rider of Balerion the Black Dread would automatically be considered the greatest in history. And winning a battle doesn't always prove who is more skilled either. Strategy, experience, teamwork with your dragon, and even a willingness to sacrifice everything can completely change the outcome. So today, we're going to answer a much more interesting question. Not who had the stronger dragon, not who was the better swordsman, not even who was the better warrior. We're asking one simple question: who was the better dragon rider? And by the end of this video, I think you'll see that the answer isn't nearly as obvious as many fans believe. But before we dive in, if you love deep dives into Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon, and the incredible history of the Targaryens, I'd really appreciate your support. This is a brand new channel, and every single subscription helps me make more videos like this. So if you enjoy this one, hit that subscribe button and join me as we explore the greatest stories in Westeros. Now let's begin. Because before you can compare Daemon and Aemond, you have to understand what separates an ordinary dragon rider from a legendary one. A dragon isn't a horse, it isn't a weapon, and it certainly isn't a machine that simply follows commands. Dragons are intelligent, they're emotional, they're unpredictable. Sometimes they obey, sometimes they don't. And as we've seen in House of the Dragon, even a rider's intentions can be ignored when a dragon's instincts take over. That's why riding a dragon isn't just about courage, it's about building trust. It's about understanding your dragon's personality. It's about knowing exactly what that dragon is capable of in the middle of a life or death battle. And that's where Daemon immediately stands apart. Long before Aemond was even born, Daemon was already one of the most experienced dragon riders in the Seven Kingdoms. He claimed Caraxes while he was still a young prince, back when King Jaehaerys, the Old King, still sat the Iron Throne. From that moment on, Daemon spent decades in the skies. Think about that for a second. Not months, not a few years, decades. By the time the Dance of the Dragons began, Daemon had accumulated a lifetime of experience that almost no living rider could match. Flying wasn't something he occasionally did, it was part of who he was. Whenever Daemon disappeared from court, there was a good chance he was in the air with Caraxes. Whenever war called, Caraxes was there. Whenever danger appeared, Daemon answered it from Dragonback. That kind of experience is impossible to fake. It's the difference between someone who has driven a car for 6 months and someone who's spent 40 years behind the wheel. Eventually, instinct takes over. Every movement becomes natural. Every decision becomes automatic. That's exactly what happened with Daemon. But experience alone isn't what made him special. It was the relationship he shared with Caraxes. If you've watched House of the Dragon, you've probably noticed something unique about them. Caraxes doesn't behave like most dragons. Nicknamed the Bloodworm, he has an unusually long, lean body and a distinctive serpentine appearance. He isn't built like the massive Vhagar or the towering Vermithor. Instead, he moves with startling speed and flexibility, almost twisting through the sky like a living snake. That wasn't just because of his body, it was because of how Daemon flew him. The two fought as if they shared the same instincts. When Daemon wanted to attack, Caraxes was already moving. When Daemon pushed forward, Caraxes became even more aggressive. Watching them together almost felt like watching a single creature with two minds working toward one purpose. That's an incredibly rare connection. Throughout Targaryen history, many dragons accepted riders, but far fewer formed partnerships that looked this seamless. And that's what made Daemon so dangerous. He didn't just ride Caraxes, he understood him. Now compare that to Aemond's early life. For years, Aemond wasn't a dragon rider at all. He was the only one among his siblings without a dragon, and because of that, he became the target of relentless teasing. His brother Aegon and his nephews often mocked him, reminding him that every true Targaryen was expected to bond with a dragon. Those humiliations left scars, but they also forged something else: determination. Aemond refused to accept being the weak one. He dreamed of claiming a dragon worthy of a king, and then fate gave him the opportunity of a lifetime. After Lady Lyanna Valarian's funeral, the oldest and largest dragon in the world was riderless. Vhagar, the dragon who had once carried Queen Visenya Targaryen during Aegon's conquest. The dragon who had burned kingdoms. The dragon who had lived longer than most people could even imagine. While everyone else slept, Aemond did something almost unthinkable. He approached Vhagar alone. No army, no protection, no guarantee that he'd survive. That took unbelievable courage. One mistake, and Vhagar could have incinerated him where he stood. Instead, against all odds, the ancient dragon accepted him. In one night, Aemond went from the boy without a dragon to the rider of the most powerful dragon alive. It's one of the greatest dragon-claiming moments in all of Targaryen history, and no one can take that away from him. But here's the question that often gets overlooked. Does claiming the greatest dragon automatically make you the greatest rider? Not necessarily, because from that moment onward, Aemond and Daemon were walking very different paths. Daemon had spent decades learning every subtle movement of Caraxes. Aemond had inherited a living legend whose experience actually dwarfed his own. Think about how unusual that is. In many ways, Vhagar had seen more battles than her rider. She had fought alongside Visenya during Aegon's conquest, survived countless wars, and witnessed generations of Targaryens rise and fall. Aemond wasn't teaching a young dragon. He was trying to command one of the oldest, fiercest, and most battle-hardened creatures in the world. That came with incredible advantages, but it also came with challenges that few people ever talk about, because the bigger the dragon, the harder it becomes to control. And that distinction may end up deciding this entire debate. Now let's talk about the dragon that completely changed Aemond's life. Vhagar wasn't just another dragon, she was history itself. By the time Aemond claimed her, Vhagar had lived for nearly 2 centuries. She had flown beside Queen Visenya Targaryen during Aegon the Conqueror's invasion of Westeros. She had helped forge the Seven Kingdoms. She had survived battles, rebellions, and generations of Targaryens who came and went while she remained. Think about that for a second. Most dragons during the Dance of the Dragons had only known 1 or 2 riders. Vhagar had witnessed the rise and fall of entire generations. She was ancient, she was battle-tested, and she was absolutely enormous. When she spread her wings, she seemed less like a dragon and more like a living mountain taking flight. That's why so many people automatically give Aemond the edge. After all, if you can control the biggest dragon in the world, doesn't that make you the greatest dragon rider? Well, not exactly, because riding Vhagar wasn't the same as riding Caraxes. In fact, they couldn't have been more different. Imagine you're a fighter pilot. One aircraft is a nimble jet capable of turning on a dime. The other is a massive bomber carrying overwhelming firepower but requiring much more space to maneuver. Which one is easier to fly in a dogfight? Most people would probably choose the smaller aircraft. That's essentially the difference between Caraxes and Vhagar. Caraxes was fast, he was unpredictable, and he could twist, dive, climb, and change direction with astonishing speed for a dragon his size. Vhagar, on the other hand, relied on raw power. Every flap of her wings carried immense force, but that size came at a cost. She couldn't pivot as quickly, she couldn't accelerate as sharply, and once committed to an attack, changing direction wasn't easy. None of that made Vhagar weak, quite the opposite. It simply meant Aemond had to fight differently. Instead of dancing through the sky, Vhagar dominated it. Instead of avoiding attacks, she often powered straight through them. Instead of relying on agility, she relied on overwhelming strength. That's an important distinction because it changes how we judge Aemond's skill. Was he an incredible rider? Absolutely. No ordinary person could have commanded Vhagar into battle, but how much of his terrifying reputation came from his own abilities, and how much came from the dragon beneath him? That's the question. Let's look at one of the clearest examples, the battle at Rook's Rest. This was one of the bloodiest dragon battles of the dance. Princess Rhaenys arrived on Meleys, a dragon renowned for speed despite her age. She faced not only King Aegon on Sunfire, but eventually Aemond on Vhagar as well. Now, imagine the chaos. 3 dragons filling the sky, fire raining down, armies below watching in horror. It should have been one of the greatest tests of Aemond's ability. But notice something. When Vhagar entered the fight, the balance shifted almost instantly. Her sheer size was enough to overwhelm the battle. Sunfire was badly injured, and Mealy's fought with astonishing courage, but once Vhagar joined the fight, brute force decided the outcome. That's not to say Aemond lacked skill, far from it. He positioned Vhagar effectively and seized the opportunity, but it's hard to ignore just how much of his advantage came from riding the largest dragon alive. Now compare that to Daemon's campaigns in the Stepstones. Long before the dance, Daemon had already proven himself in real warfare. The Stepstones weren't a single glorious battle. They were years of brutal fighting, pirates, guerrilla attacks, naval engagements, changing terrain, and constant uncertainty. And through it all, Daemon and Caraxes became even more synchronized. They weren't winning because Caraxes was the biggest dragon. He wasn't. They were winning because Rider and Dragon understood exactly how to fight together. Every campaign sharpened their instincts, every battle strengthened their trust. It's easy to forget that dragon combat isn't just about breathing fire. A rider has to read the battlefield, watch enemy movements, manage altitude, predict where another dragon is heading, know when to attack, and know when to retreat, all while controlling a creature with a mind of its own. That's an extraordinary amount to process, and Daemon had been doing it for decades. Another fascinating difference between these two riders is their personalities. Aemond fought with anger. There's no denying it. Much of his life was shaped by humiliation, resentment, and an overwhelming desire to prove himself. Once he claimed Vhagar, he became feared across Westeros, and he embraced that fear. He wanted people to tremble when they heard his name. He wanted his enemies to believe they had no chance against him. That confidence made him dangerous, but sometimes it also made him reckless. We see this during his campaign through the Riverlands. Instead of focusing solely on military objectives, Aemond often allowed his rage to guide his decisions. Village after village burned beneath Vhagar's flames. The destruction was immense, yet strategically it achieved far less than he'd hoped. His reputation for terror grew, but so did his reputation for brutality. Daemon, meanwhile, approached war differently. Was he ruthless? Without question. But Daemon rarely acted without purpose. Even when his choices were morally questionable, there was usually a calculation behind them. He didn't simply attack because he was angry. He attacked because he believed it advanced his position. That difference matters enormously when evaluating dragon riders because a dragon amplifies its rider's decisions. An impulsive rider becomes even more dangerous. A disciplined rider becomes even more effective. Then there's another detail that often gets overlooked: control. One of the greatest revelations in House of the Dragon is that dragons aren't slaves. They're not machines programmed to obey. They have instincts, emotions, fear, and rage. We see this most clearly when dragons react on their own, despite their rider's commands. It's a reminder that no rider has absolute control. Instead, the best dragon riders develop something closer to cooperation, and this is where Daemon may have had the greatest advantage of all. Whenever Daemon and Caraxes took to the skies, there was an effortless rhythm between them. Caraxes didn't merely obey, he anticipated. He responded almost instinctively. It was as though dragon and rider trusted each other completely. With Aemond and Vhagar, the relationship feels different. Not weaker, just different. Vhagar often feels like an ancient force of nature that even Aemond is guiding rather than fully controlling. She's older than him by nearly 200 years. She has survived countless wars. She has instincts forged over generations. When Vhagar attacks, you sometimes get the impression that she's acting not only on command, but also on centuries of experience. And that raises one final question before we reach the greatest dragon duel in Targaryen history. If both men had switched dragons, would Daemon have been just as effective on Vhagar? Would Aemond have achieved the same success on Caraxes? The answer to that question might reveal who the superior dragon rider truly was. So far, we've looked at their experience, we've looked at their dragons, we've looked at the completely different relationships they had with those dragons. Now it's time for the real comparison. If you stripped away the names, if you ignored the size of their dragons, if you judged them purely on skill, who actually comes out on top? Let's start with something that's surprisingly overlooked: battle IQ. Because dragon combat isn't just about flying faster or breathing hotter fire, it's a game of chess played thousands of feet in the air. Every movement matters. Every turn can expose your dragon's neck. Every dive can leave your wings vulnerable. Every second you're looking at your enemy is a second you aren't looking at the ground rushing toward you. The best dragon riders don't just react, they think 3 moves ahead. And if there's one thing Daemon Targaryen was famous for, it was thinking ahead. This wasn't a man who simply charged into battle swinging Dark Sister and hoping for the best. People often describe Daemon as reckless because he loved danger, but reckless and fearless aren't the same thing. Daemon took risks, calculated risks. Look at the war for the Stepstones. For years, he fought an enemy that knew the terrain better than he did. The Triarchy wasn't stronger, they were smarter. They hid in caves, they attacked from unexpected directions, and they refused to fight on Daemon's terms. Yet somehow, Daemon kept adapting. He learned, he changed tactics, and he used Caraxes not simply as a weapon, but as an extension of his strategy. That's one of the marks of a truly elite dragon rider. Knowing when not to use your dragon is just as important as knowing when to unleash it. Now let's compare that to Aemond. There's no question he was brave. No one who claims Vhagar can ever be called a coward. But bravery can become overconfidence, and overconfidence has ended more wars than cowardice ever has. As the dance dragged on, Aemond slowly started believing something dangerous. He believed no one could defeat him. And honestly, can you blame him? Imagine riding the biggest dragon alive. Imagine every castle opening its gates because they know resistance is hopeless. Imagine armies scattering the moment they hear Vhagar's roar. After enough victories, you begin to feel invincible. That's exactly what happened. Aemond stopped thinking like a commander and started thinking like a conqueror. Instead of carefully hunting enemy dragons, he spent months burning villages across the Riverlands. Entire towns disappeared beneath dragonfire, fields turned black, and thousands died. It was horrifying, but strategically, it achieved very little. In fact, while Aemond was busy spreading terror, the Blacks were reorganizing elsewhere. His greatest weapon was being used for destruction instead of decisive victories. Daemon would have recognized that mistake immediately, because Daemon understood something Aemond never fully grasped. Fear is useful, but victory is better. Now let's talk about something that separates average riders from legends. Knowing your dragon, not just its strength, but its personality. Every dragon is different. Some are naturally aggressive, others are cautious, some enjoy battle, others have to be pushed. Think about Caraxes, nicknamed the Blood Worm. He wasn't enormous, and he wasn't the strongest, but he was relentless. Caraxes almost seemed to enjoy combat. He attacked with astonishing aggression, and he kept fighting even after suffering horrific injuries. That's exactly the kind of dragon Daemon needed, because Daemon himself fought the same way. Fast, bold, and unexpected. Neither of them hesitated. It was like watching 2 halves of the same warrior. Now think about Vhagar. She wasn't aggressive in the same way. She didn't need to be. Imagine an elephant fighting a wolf. The elephant doesn't chase, it waits. One clean hit ends the fight. That was Vhagar. She relied on overwhelming force. One bite, one blast of dragonfire, one crushing impact. Against most dragons, that was enough. So here's the fascinating question. Did Aemond adapt to Vhagar, or did Vhagar shape the way Aemond fought? Personally, I think it was both. Aemond became increasingly dependent on Vhagar's unmatched size and power. It was an advantage few riders in history had ever possessed, and naturally, he learned to use it. But that reliance also had a downside. When you have the biggest dragon in the world, you stop expecting anyone to outthink you. Daemon never had that luxury. Every battle required creativity, every victory had to be earned, and perhaps that's why his instincts became so sharp. Let's compare their aerial styles. If dragon combat were a boxing match, Aemond was the heavyweight. Every punch had knockout power, and he only needed one opening. Daemon was the master technician, constant movement, changing angles, and creating opportunities that shouldn't exist. He didn't wait for mistakes, he forced them. That's why Caraxes could challenge dragons that looked far stronger on paper. Speed changes everything. A smaller target is harder to catch, and a quicker dragon dictates the pace. Even in modern aerial combat, agility often beats raw size. The same principle applies here. Now, none of this means Daemon was unbeatable. Far from it. He knew Caraxes couldn't simply overpower Vhagar. That would have been suicide. And here's where the debate reaches its most interesting point. The greatest dragon rider isn't necessarily the one who wins every fight. It's the one who understands their own limitations. That sounds strange, but think about it. A bad commander believes he can win every battle. A great commander knows exactly which battles he shouldn't fight. Daemon understood both. He knew Caraxes wasn't stronger, he knew Vhagar was larger, and he knew Aemond had the advantage in raw power. So instead of trying to beat Vhagar at her own game, he spent months thinking about how to beat her at his. That's the mindset of a strategist. Aemond, meanwhile, was convinced that no dragon could truly challenge Vhagar, and that confidence slowly turned into predictability. He expected enemies to run. Daemon didn't. He expected Daemon to hide. Daemon came looking for him. He expected fear. Daemon brought determination. And that's the difference between these two men. One trusted in overwhelming strength, while the other trusted in preparation, timing, and instinct. Which brings us to the single greatest dragon battle George R.R. Martin has ever written. A duel so legendary that even centuries later, people in Westeros still tell the story. It was a battle where strategy would clash with brute force, where experience would face youthful confidence, and where two dragons and two riders would push each other beyond their limits. And in the end, only one rider would achieve exactly what he set out to do. In the final part, we're soaring above the God's Eye to break down every crucial moment of that unforgettable duel. Explain why Daemon's final move has become one of the most iconic scenes in all of A Song of Ice and Fire. And finally, answer the question we've been asking from the very beginning: who was truly the better dragon rider? And now, we arrive at the moment that would forever define both men: the battle above the God's Eye. If you've only watched House of the Dragon, you probably already know this duel is legendary. But when you really stop and think about what happened that day, it becomes even more incredible. Because this wasn't simply two dragon riders spotting each other by chance. This was a hunt. For months, Aemond had terrorized the Riverlands. Everywhere he went, villages burned, castles surrendered, and entire regions lived in fear of seeing Vhagar's shadow pass overhead. He wanted Daemon to face him, believing no one else in Westeros was worthy. And Daemon knew exactly what Aemond wanted, but instead of chasing him recklessly, he waited. That tells you everything you need to know about Daemon's mindset. He wasn't driven by pride, he was driven by opportunity. He understood something that Aemond never fully appreciated. Against an opponent stronger than you don't choose the battlefield carelessly. You choose it perfectly. Eventually, Daemon arrived at Harrenhal. From there, he waited patiently. He knew Aemond's personality almost as well as he knew his own. He knew Aemond's greatest weakness wasn't Vhagar. It was his ego. Aemond wanted the glory of defeating Daemon himself, and that made him predictable. Sure enough, the trap worked. When Aemond learned Daemon was at Harrenhal, he couldn't resist. Mounted on Vhagar, he flew to confront the man he considered his greatest rival. Neither rider hesitated, neither dragon backed down. As they took to the skies above the God's Eye, everyone watching must have realized they were witnessing history. Imagine the scene. Below them stretched the largest lake in the Riverlands, calm and silent. Above it, two dragons circled each other. One was Vhagar, ancient, scarred, the conqueror of kingdoms, and a living relic from Aegon's conquest. The other was Caraxes, the bloodworm, smaller, faster, and hungry for battle. It looked almost unfair. If you were a soldier watching from the ground, who would you have bet on? Probably Vhagar. Almost everyone would have, because on paper this wasn't a fair fight. Vhagar was older, larger, and stronger. She outweighed Caraxes by an enormous margin. Her jaws could crush him, and her fire could engulf him. If dragon battles were decided by size alone, this duel would have lasted seconds. But Daemon wasn't fighting on paper. He was fighting in the sky. And in the sky, movement matters, timing matters, and positioning matters. This is where decades of experience began to show. Rather than meeting Vhagar head-on, Daemon constantly forced Caraxes to use his greatest strength, agility. Every turn, every climb, and every dive, Caraxes kept moving like a serpent, wrapping itself around a much larger beast. Meanwhile, Vhagar had to keep adjusting. Every adjustment cost time, every correction cost momentum. Eventually, Daemon saw the opening he'd been waiting for. Caraxes slammed into Vhagar from below. It was an incredibly dangerous maneuver. One mistake, and both dragon and rider would have been crushed instantly. Instead, Caraxes locked onto Vhagar. The two dragons became entangled. Claws tore through scales, teeth ripped flesh, and fire exploded in every direction. The sky itself seemed to be on fire. Even then, the battle wasn't over. Now comes the moment that has become one of the greatest scenes in all of George R.R. Martin's world. As the dragons struggled together, Daemon did something no one expected. He unfastened the chains securing him to his saddle. Think about what that means. Most riders strapped themselves in because being thrown from a dragon at that height meant certain death. Daemon willingly removed his only protection. He wasn't trying to survive anymore. He was trying to make absolutely certain Aemond wouldn't. Then, in one impossible leap, Daemon launched himself through the air, sword in hand, suspended for a single heartbeat between two dragons thousands of feet above the lake. And with Dark Sister, he drove the Valyrian steel blade straight through Aemond's remaining eye. One strike, one perfect strike. The prince who believed no one could defeat him was dead before either dragon hit the water. Moments later, the dragons crashed into the god's eye with enough force to shake the shoreline. Water erupted into the air, fire hissed into steam, and both dragons disappeared beneath the surface. Caraxes somehow managed to crawl onto the shore despite suffering catastrophic wounds before finally dying. Vhagar sank beneath the waters of the lake alongside her rider. Daemon's body was never found. Whether he died instantly, whether he drowned, or whether George R.R. Martin intentionally left the mystery unsolved, no one truly knows. But for our debate, his fate isn't actually the most important part. The important part is how he fought. Let's go back to the question we asked at the very beginning. Who was the better dragon rider? If you're judging purely by the dragon each man rode, Aemond wins. No debate. Vhagar was the largest, most powerful dragon alive, giving Aemond an advantage that almost no rider in history could match. But if you're judging the rider, the person making the decisions, the one reading the battle, the one understanding his dragon's strengths and weaknesses, the answer starts to look very different. When you think of Daemon, you immediately think of Caraxes. When you think of Caraxes, you immediately think of Daemon. It's almost impossible to imagine one without the other. That kind of bond can't be measured by size, it can't be measured by age, and it certainly can't be measured by fear. It can only be measured by trust. And in my opinion, that's why Daemon Targaryen deserves the title of the superior dragon rider. Not because he had the bigger dragon, not because he lived longer, and not even because he killed Aemond, but because he understood the art of dragon riding on a level very few people in Targaryen history ever reached. Of course, that's just my opinion. Now I want to hear yours.